It began on a quiet August night in 2025. The James Webb Space Telescope, our most powerful eye on the universe, was suddenly forced into an emergency override. Not for a collapsing star, not for a black hole devouring matter, but for something stranger, quieter, and infinitely more unsettling. An object had entered our solar system. At first, astronomers thought it was just another comet, icy, predictable, harmless. They named it the third interstellar visitor ever recorded, 3I Atlas. But almost immediately, something was wrong. The first wave of data made scientists sit back in their chairs. Its chemical fingerprint was unlike anything ever seen. Normally, comets breathe out water when they near the warmth of the Sunday, but this one? Its breath was almost entirely carbon dioxide, 8 times stronger than its water output. A ratio so bizarre it shattered the models that had held for decades. And that was just the beginning. When Webb locked on with its infrared sensors, another shock appeared. The comet's gases glowed with the signature of nickel-bright, undeniable nickel lines in the spectrum. But iron? Practically none. This was impossible. Nickel and iron are cosmic twins. They form together in stars, they fall together in meteorites, and they've been paired in every comet and asteroid humanity has ever studied. But 3I Atlas seemed to have broken that rule. Its nickel-to-iron ratio was so extreme, scientists didn't know whether to call it an error or a message. As news filtered through the astronomy community, one unsettling comparison surfaced again and again. Oumuamua, that first strange visitor in 2017 that refused to behave like a natural rock. That strange traveler that skipped out of our solar system faster than gravity should have allowed. Could it be that 3I Atlas was another case of the universe refusing to play by its own rules? But then, something happened that forced everyone to stop calling this a comet. For 3 straight nights, telescopes around the world tracked the object's path, and instead of curving gently under the pull of gravity, it jolted. Its velocity increased in sharp, erratic bursts, as if something inside it were firing. And even more mysterious, its brightness pulsed every 7.2 hours. Not like a random spin, but like the flash of a lighthouse, regular, precise, mechanical. The James Webb team went silent. NASA's Planetary Defense Office marked it as a high anomaly. And behind the curtain, whispers began to spread. Was this simply the strangest comet ever discovered? Or was it something made? Before we go deeper, don't forget to subscribe. It helps you stay connected as we uncover the most mysterious discoveries in the universe, one chilling detail at a time. The truth about 3I Atlas is that it doesn't behave like it wants to be ignored. When astronomers pointed the Hubble Space Telescope at it for confirmation, what they saw only deepened the puzzle. The coma, the hazy atmosphere of dust and gas surrounding it, should have looked familiar. Comets always release clouds of frozen water, specks of dust, sometimes carbon monoxide. But 3I Atlas glowed differently. Its light scattered in a way that didn't match standard dust. It was as if the particles themselves were metallic, like ground-up filings drifting through the void. And then came the strangest reading yet. High-resolution spectroscopy revealed sharp, narrow lines of nickel gas. Imagine heating a chunk of metal so hot it begins to glow and vaporize, except this wasn't happening near a furnace or even close to the sunday. This was nickel evaporating in deep, cold space, far beyond where such chemistry should even be possible. To put it in perspective, if you melted down all the nickels, coins, and stainless steel in human civilization, it still wouldn't explain the scale of nickel being shared by this one object. But without its twin element, iron, the chemistry just didn't make sense. Some astrophysicists joked darkly that it looked like the leftovers of an impossible factory, as though someone, somewhere, had been extracting resources and thrown the rest away. The shape of its light curve only raised more eyebrows. Every 7.2 hours, the brightness surged, then faded, then surged again. Like the swing of a pendulum, like a beacon turning steadily in the dark. Natural comets spin and tumble chaotically, wobbling like a top about to fall. But Three-Eye Atlas held its rhythm, precise, cold, predictable. That predictability was echoed in another strange behavior, its acceleration. Over 72 hours, astronomers charted its velocity, expecting the usual smooth curve caused by gas jets pushing against its icy surface. Instead, the object leapt. The data looked jagged, like it was firing thrusters in short, powerful bursts. And though no one wanted to say it out loud, the implication haunted every lab and observatory. This wasn't random. NASA's Planetary Defense Office doesn't label things lightly. When they mark an object as a high anomaly, it isn't for publicity. It's a red flag. It means the rules we usually trust to predict or explain motion no longer apply. It means we're looking at something new and possibly something dangerous. And yet, scientists hesitated. Memories of Oumuamua were still raw. That strange elongated shard that skipped away without a clear explanation. Some had suggested it was artificial back then too, but the idea was dismissed as sensational. The safer story was always that nature had surprised us. But now, Three-Eye Atlas made that excuse harder to swallow. Because this time, the signals weren't subtle. This time, the data wasn't ambiguous. This time, the anomalies stacked up like bricks on a wall, building a picture no one wanted to admit they were seeing. Still, others argued for patience. Perhaps this was a fragment from a star system rich in carbon dioxide. Perhaps the nickel had formed in an unusual nebula, leaving iron behind. Perhaps the jagged acceleration was simply an extreme case of cometary outgassing. Science always bends toward natural explanations first. But with each new observation, the natural explanations bent further and further until they threatened to break. And, as if that weren't enough, history began to whisper its own eerie reminders. Ancient cultures had long spoken of iron from heaven. Nickel-rich alloys that fell to earth in meteorites were once treasured as gifts from the gods. In Egyptian tombs, in Mesopotamian relics, in the blaze of early kings, fragments of space metal became symbols of divine power. And here, now, was a comet made almost entirely of that same alien signature, an object breathing nickel into the night. Somewhere between those whispers of history and the hard numbers of science, a realization began to grow. Maybe this wasn't just a comet at all. Maybe it was something left behind, something drifting, something we were never meant to find. If the story of Three-Eye Atlas had ended with strange chemistry and awkward numbers, maybe the world would have shrugged and moved on. Astronomers love puzzles, but they also love solving them, and yet this puzzle wasn't getting solved, it was only growing. By late August, more telescopes joined the hunt. The European Space Agency's swarm satellites, designed to monitor Earth's magnetic field, detected faint ripples whenever the object brightened in its strange 7.2-hour cycle. It was as though the comet's light wasn't just light. It carried with it a kind of energy signature, subtle but measurable, a heartbeat in the vacuum of space. For engineers working on navigation satellites, that was a chilling detail. Our entire modern world depends on predictable signals. GPS satellites overhead, timing signals for financial systems, radio waves that knit together the fabric of modern society. If an interstellar object could nudge those signals, however slightly, what else might it be capable of? Still, the mainstream story focused on natural explanations. The line from NASA briefings was careful, almost rehearsed. Three-Eye Atlas was an unusual visitor, yes, but not outside the realm of possibility. Every time someone raised the word artificial, officials gently redirected back to the idea of rare chemistry. Unprecedented, they would say, but not impossible. Behind the scenes, however, the tension was palpable. Internal memos, later leaked, revealed that some researchers had quietly classified the object as a structured anomaly. That's bureaucratic language for, we don't know what this is, but it doesn't act like a rock. And then came the photographs. Not from Hubble or Webb this time, but from smaller observatories scattered across the globe. Amateur astronomers, people with backyard setups, caught images during the comet's flare cycle. What they reported was unnerving. Instead of the fuzzy, irregular glow of dust, their images showed something sharp, clean lines, geometric flares. One particularly famous capture showed two parallel streaks of light emerging from the coma, like beams cast from hidden windows. It was easy to dismiss cheap lenses, overexposed frames, artifacts of long exposures. But the timing matched Webb's data almost exactly. When the big telescopes saw the object flare, so did the backyard cameras. Too consistent to be coincidence, too exact to be dismissed. Theories multiplied. Some claimed the object was hollow, perhaps a shell left behind by some ancient event. Others whispered it might be a probe, disguising itself as debris. A few suggested it was even more bizarre, a natural phenomenon that just happened to mimic design, the same way a cloud can sometimes look like a face. But the truth was harder to escape. Nature doesn't often mimic design at this scale, and design, once suspected, is impossible to ignore. Cultural echoes began surfacing again. Journalists pointed out the strange timing that August 6, the day the object forced Webb into emergency override, coincided with anniversaries of world-changing events back on Earth. Some called it coincidence. Others muttered about omens. Humans have always sought meaning in the sky, after all. But here, for once, the sky seemed to be staring back. Meanwhile, the light curve grew sharper. What began as a mild pulse now appeared crisp, like the flicker of a rotating mirror or a spinning structure. Software models suggested the object could be flat, thin, or even sail-like, something designed to harness light itself for propulsion. And if that was true, then 3I Atlas wasn't drifting randomly through our system at all. It was moving with intent. As the data piled up, the real problem wasn't just the numbers. It was the people. Scientists, researchers, and even government agencies were starting to fracture into camps. Some pushed hard for the natural explanation. To them, 3I Atlas was a gift, an exotic interstellar object unlike anything we had ever seen. They spoke of carbon-rich nebulae, strange chemical processes in the birth of distant star systems, and the possibility of comets being far more diverse than we ever imagined. But others couldn't accept that answer, not because they wanted something extraordinary, but because the math just didn't fit. Nickel without iron wasn't just rare, it was chemically absurd. Erratic acceleration wasn't just unusual, it was impossible to reconcile with any known natural law. And the regular mechanical rhythm of the light curve, that was the hardest detail of all to explain away. The debate spilled into public view. Journals rejected papers that leaned too far into artificial object theories, while blogs and underground science forums buzzed with speculation. Leaked documents only fueled the fire. One memo, supposedly from inside NASA's Planetary Defense Office, bluntly described 3I Atlas as a structured body under observation. Another, from an ESA conference, quietly floated the idea of non-gravitational propulsion without daring to use the word engine. And then history stepped into the room. Reporters began digging through old records, and what they found sent shivers down more than a few spines. In the archives of the late 20th century, during the era of the mysterious visitor called Oumuamua, the same arguments had played out. Back then, too, some scientists argued it was natural. Others whispered it might be a probe. The official line never budged, but the unease lingered. Even further back, historians pulled records of strange celestial visitors that baffled astronomers of their time. The Chinese sky charts, the Arabic scholars, even medieval monks, they all recorded wandering stars that behaved strangely, defying prediction. Were those just coincidences, or had Earth been visited before in ways we failed to understand? And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all came from Earth's own geology. Researchers pointed out that humanity has already encountered nickel-rich metals unlike anything formed here. Ancient Egyptian relics, carved from meteoritic iron, bore signatures eerily similar to the spectral fingerprints of 3I Atlas. To ancient civilizations, this iron from heaven was sacred divine. Could it be that long before telescopes, humans had already been touched by the same strange materials drifting through our solar system? The challenge was no longer just to study the object. It was to decide what it meant. To accept that either the universe was far stranger than we dared to imagine, or that we were no longer just observers of cosmic phenomena, we were participants. And if that was the case, then 3I Atlas wasn't just a comet, it was a message, a question hanging in the sky, waiting for us to answer. For weeks, the James Webb Telescope kept its gaze locked on 3I Atlas. The longer it watched, the stranger the story became. Because what was once thought to be a distant comet had begun to behave like a machine. Every 7.2 hours, its light flared sharp, deliberate, unchanging. At first, astronomers assumed this was just rotational behavior, sunlight bouncing off an uneven surface. But comets don't keep time like clockwork. Their spin wobbles, their surfaces scatter light in chaotic patterns, and yet here was 3I Atlas, pulsing like a lighthouse across the dark ocean of space. The more data Webb collected, the more undeniable the rhythm became. It wasn't fading, it wasn't drifting, it was steady, precise, too precise. And then came the second revelation. Instruments on Earth radio telescopes, magnetometers, even deep space monitors started picking up faint electromagnetic disturbances, synchronized with those same pulses. On one night in late September, a chain of ground stations across South America recorded a series of micro-fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field that matched the cycle exactly. It was as though the object wasn't just reflecting light, it was broadcasting. That possibility divided the scientific world even further. Some argued this was just coincidence, a trick of solar wind interacting with a strange chemical mix. Others weren't so sure. Coincidence doesn't keep time, one astrophysicist said in a closed-door briefing. Coincidence doesn't repeat itself every 7.2 hours. What unsettled researchers even more was the discovery of a second layer to the signal, buried within the light curve. Nearly invisible at first glance, was a faint modulation, an echo, as though something within the object was moving, shifting, reconfiguring. It reminded some of a heartbeat. At the same time, telescopes began to record something else, a faint trail of nickel-rich material streaming behind 3I Atlas. But the trail wasn't random. It came in bursts, released in sudden sharp outflows perfectly timed with the brightness pulses, almost as if the object was venting deliberately. To test this, a team at the European Southern Observatory ran a daring simulation. If the pulses were acting like thrust-tiny jets pushing the object, its erratic acceleration would make sense. And the simulation worked. The model fit the data. The bursts aligned. This was no longer a question of could it be, but what is it doing? Meanwhile, news of the anomaly had leaked. While NASA and ESA issued careful, cautious statements, the internet caught fire. Some people called it the Atlas Beacon. Others named it the Nickel Star. Forums buzzed with speculation. Was it a probe? A derelict? A fragment of some long-dead civilization drifting between the stars? But one theory stood out above all others. What if 3I Atlas wasn't traveling alone? What if those pulses weren't just signals but a way of guiding, calling, or answering? Suddenly, the mystery wasn't just about an object in the void. It was about what might be waiting at the other end of its signal. It began with a whisper. A handful of researchers spread across observatories in Chile, Hawaii, and South Africa noticed something odd buried inside the rhythm of 3I Atlas. The 7.2-hour pulses weren't just flickers of light. They carried structure. Think of it like listening to a heartbeat through a stethoscope. At first, All you hear is a steady thump, thump. But the longer you listen, the more you pick out tiny variations, pauses, double strikes, murmurs that shouldn't be there. That was what the astronomers found. Within the pulses, there were faint fluctuations, patterns nested inside patterns, as though something was encoding a signal into the light itself. It was subtle, almost impossible to prove. But one graduate student at MIT noticed that the brightness curve repeated every 9th cycle. Another analyst in France noticed the same sequence matched a prime number ratio. And when the two compared notes, they realized the light wasn't random at all. It was mathematical. This discovery sparked a quiet storm behind closed doors. In one classified meeting, a senior astrophysicist reportedly said, "If this is true, it means the object isn't just moving, it's speaking." The theory was simple but chilling. The pulses might be carrying information like a cosmic Morse code. And if that was true, humanity was no longer just observing a comet. We were intercepting a message. But how do you test such a thing without jumping to wild conclusions? The scientific community knew the risks. The memory of Oumuamua still haunted them, an object once thought to be an alien probe, later explained away as an exotic natural fragment. They couldn't afford to make the same mistake twice. So teams began quietly testing the signal. They took the brightness data, filtered it through algorithms, and looked for repeating sequences. What they found was unnerving. The fluctuations didn't match any known natural phenomena, no star flicker, no dust scatter, no instrument error. Instead, they formed clean geometric structures when mapped into frequency space, triangles, spirals, grids. At the same time, something stranger began happening closer to home. Amateur radio astronomers, hobbyists with backyard dishes started reporting odd bursts of static at the exact times 3I Atlas pulsed. The static wasn't strong, barely noticeable, but some claimed it carried faint harmonics, as though an echo of the signal had slipped across space and brushed Earth's atmosphere. Soon, conspiracy forums lit up. People posted spectrograms, annotated charts, and late-night recordings. Some swore they heard voices in the noise. Others claimed the pulses aligned with ancient Sumerian star maps, or even the strange glyphs carved into megaliths in South America. And, in the middle of it all, one unsettling question kept surfacing. If 3I Atlas was broadcasting, then who or what was supposed to receive it? NASA tried to calm the storm. In an official statement, they described the light pulses as interesting but likely natural. They emphasized caution, reminding the public that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But behind closed doors, documents leaked that told a different story. Webb's own engineers had run simulations. The pulses were too precise, too clean, too perfect to ignore. It wasn't proof. But it was enough to suggest that, maybe, just maybe, Earth had stumbled upon a signal never meant for us, a message written in light, drifting across the void, wrapped inside a comet-shaped shell. And the strangest part, the pulses were growing stronger. The discovery of the signal ignited a quiet war behind the scenes. In one corner of the debate stood the scientists, the data-driven, cautious voices who insisted on gathering more evidence before making any rash moves. In the other corner were the strategists, the defense planners, and the politicians who whispered, "What if we're already too late?" For weeks, closed-door meetings stretched across NASA, the European Space Agency, and classified Pentagon task forces. Documents later leaked described them as war councils for the unknown. The question they wrestled with wasn't abstract. It was painfully real. Should Earth attempt to answer the pulses coming from 3I Atlas? The arguments against were fierce. Many scientists pointed to the Fermi paradox, the question of why, if intelligent civilizations exist, none have revealed themselves to us. They warned that revealing our presence to a signal that might not be meant for us could invite disaster. One astrophysicist famously quipped, "If you hear a whisper in the dark woods, you don't shout back. You stay silent and listen." But others pushed back. The signal was growing stronger, its geometry becoming more complex. To some, this wasn't a broadcast. It was an invitation, and refusing to answer might mean missing the greatest opportunity in human history. So plans began forming. Engineers discussed how to mimic the pulse patterns using Earth's most powerful radio telescopes, from Arecibo's long-defunct dish to the vast arrays in Australia and South Africa. Mathematicians drafted sequences, prime numbers, hydrogen frequencies, universal constants that could serve as a first reply. And yet, the more they prepared, the more uneasy they became. Because every model suggested something chilling. 3I Atlas wasn't just broadcasting randomly into the void. Its beam was directional, focused, targeted. That raised a frightening possibility. Maybe the message wasn't even meant for Earth. Maybe we were just in the way. Amid the debates, a small group of researchers tried something in secret. In the dead of night, at an isolated observatory in Chile, they aligned a radio array and sent out a pulse short, faint, almost like a knock on a distant door. The reply came 21 minutes later. Not words. Not even a signal in the usual sense. But the comet's light shifted an extra flicker added to its rhythm, one that lined up perfectly with the time the pulse had been sent. For those who witnessed it, the moment was life-altering. The object had heard them, it had listened, and it had answered. Word of the exchange spread like wildfire through classified circles. Though the public remained in the dark, but inside the labs, the truth was undeniable. Earth had spoken to something, and it had spoken back. And that raised the most terrifying question yet. What happens when the conversation truly begins? It started, as world-changing events often do, with a leak. A blurry screenshot slipped onto a small physics forum. It showed an internal email chain, object response verified, light curve modulation observed, awaiting secondary confirmation. Within hours, the post was deleted, but the internet never forgets. Copies spread like wildfire, jumping from obscure science blogs to Reddit threads to front-page news. Suddenly, the quiet secret that only a handful of scientists had guarded was in the open. 3I Atlas had answered. The public reaction was explosive. Some people were euphoric. Hashtags like number "We Are Not Alone" and number "Atlas Signal" surged to the top of every social platform. Others were terrified, warning that reaching out to an unknown intelligence was reckless, even suicidal. Politicians scrambled, issuing carefully worded denials. Yet denials couldn't stop the grainy leaked videos footage of the comet's flickering pulses synced with Earth's radio transmissions spreading across millions of screens. Religions weighed in too. Some called it a sign of divine presence, a fulfillment of prophecy. Others condemned it as dangerous heresy. For ordinary people, though, the emotions were far simpler. Awe, fear, and a gnawing sense that the universe had just gotten a little smaller. But while the world debated, something else was happening, something far harder to ignore. The pulses of Three-Eye Atlas were changing. No longer were they simple repeating patterns. Now, faint variations appeared, structured in ways that looked less like random rhythms and more like sequences. At first, scientists dismissed it as noise. But when the sequence repeated 3 times, perfectly, the truth was undeniable. The object wasn't just answering, it was speaking. Governments held emergency broadcasts. NASA confirmed an anomalous signal of possible artificial origin. The European Space Agency admitted that the James Webb Telescope had been monitoring the pulses around the clock. Even the Pentagon acknowledged the object's acceleration defied known physics. And then came the most unsettling observation yet. The flickering wasn't just data, it was pointing. Every analysis, every telescope feed, every algorithm seemed to agree. The pulses were gradually aligning toward Earth. The message was no longer floating in the void. It was coming straight for us. The first whispers of decoding came quietly, late at night, inside dimly lit labs. Screens glowed with streams of numbers and graphs, their patterns looping endlessly. For weeks, the pulses from Three-Eye Atlas had been regular, calm, repetitive, almost hypnotic. But now they carried something new. Slight pauses, tiny gaps, deliberate variations. Dr. Helena Ortiz at the European Space Agency described it best. It's like listening to a heartbeat that suddenly starts to speak in Morse code. At first, many thought it was random noise, a trick of instruments, interference from solar storms, or even coding errors. But as the data piled up, the patterns refused to disappear. They grew sharper, more consistent, aligning in ways no natural comet behavior could explain. Teams from NASA, ESA, and Harvard worked day and night, comparing notes with radio astronomers in Japan, Australia, and South Africa. The same conclusion echoed across the globe. The object was transmitting structured information. And then came the chilling realization. The variations weren't just random sequences. They repeated over and over. Each cycle a little faster. Each cycle a little clearer. Some scientists argued it was mathematics' prime numbers hidden in the gaps, a classic sign of intelligence. Others thought it was geometry, with ratios pointing to specific orbital alignments. But one theory rose above the rest, whispered with growing unease. It was a countdown. Not everyone agreed. Some claimed the pulses marked a rotation period or a natural oscillation. But deep inside NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a classified briefing laid out the uncomfortable math. If the sequence was time-based, the endpoint lined up with mid-September 2025, roughly 3 weeks away. Outside the labs, humanity was already restless. News anchors speculated endlessly. Some tabloids screamed of alien invasion. Others mocked the idea, calling it nothing more than a scientific blunder. But ordinary people, those staring up at the night sky, wondering if a message was racing toward Earth, felt the weight of it in their bones. In South America, a crowd gathered at an ancient observatory chanting prayers to the stars. In Tokyo, thousands lined rooftops with telescopes, searching for the faint glimmer of the mysterious object. In New York, digital billboards lit up with the hashtag number #ThePulse. Meanwhile, in private, governments prepared. Satellite networks were quietly reoriented. Secure military briefings raised scenarios that had once belonged to science fiction. What if the object wasn't a comet? What if it was a probe, a machine, or worse, a weapon? But not all responses were born from fear. Some saw hope. What if the countdown wasn't to destruction but to contact? What if the flickering lights weren't a warning but an invitation? Dr. Amir Khalid, a physicist from Cairo, spoke softly during a live interview. If you were lost in the desert and saw another fire burning in the distance, would you run away in fear, or would you walk toward it, knowing someone else is alive? And so, humanity split in two, half terrified, half curious, both waiting, both staring into the abyss of the unknown. And above all the noise, one undeniable fact remained. 3I Atlas was still moving closer. The pulses from 3I Atlas had already unsettled the scientific world, but the true shock came when computers at MIT, Caltech, and the Max Planck Institute all independently flagged the same anomaly. Hidden inside the rhythmic flicker of light was a repeating sequence, one that didn't just echo mathematics, but seemed to outline something far more familiar. At first, researchers thought it was geometry. The sequence aligned into shapes, triangles, circles, and arcs. But when layered together, the patterns formed something impossible to dismiss. They weren't random at all. They were maps. Maps of orbits, maps of planetary alignments, and most disturbingly, maps that pointed back to Earth. When this revelation leaked, even in whispers, panic quietly rippled through the scientific community. Was this comet, or whatever it truly was, signaling Earth directly? Was it broadcasting coordinates as if to say, "I see you"? The light variations grew sharper. Every 7.2 hours, the so-called lighthouse cycle delivered another set of pulses, another round of signals. They repeated not just once, but in multiples, as if redundancy mattered, as though the sender wanted no chance of misinterpretation. Some teams argued that it was coincidence, that natural processes can mimic order if you look hard enough. But others, including Dr. Yuna Mori in Tokyo, dismissed that explanation. We are no longer looking at noise, we are looking at intent. The data is too clean to deliberate. At NASA, meetings stretched into dawn. Military liaisons demanded to know if this meant hostile intent. Diplomats asked whether Earth should prepare to respond. And in one particularly heated session, a senior physicist posed a question no one dared to answer. What if we already have responded? What if the very act of observing triggered this exchange? Meanwhile, the public was not blind to what was unfolding. Online forums filled with decoded diagrams, amateur astronomers posted overlays of the patterns against Earth's orbital charts, and hashtags like Number Atlas Message began trending globally. For ordinary people, the thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. If an object from beyond the stars was mapping Earth, what did that mean? A warning? A beacon? Or a rendezvous? In South America, spiritual leaders claimed the pulses matched rhythms in ancient chants. In Egypt, an archaeologist pointed out similarities between the sequences and glyphs carved into a temple wall. And in Silicon Valley, tech entrepreneurs already dreamed of unlocking alien algorithms for humanity's use. But the truth remained far simpler and far heavier. The object, still moving closer to Mars, had revealed something unmistakable. It was not silent. It was speaking. And the question pressing on every mind, from presidents to farmers, from astrophysicists to children staring at the night sky, was whether humanity was ready to hear what came next. Behind closed doors, governments began working on two tracks, one public, one hidden. Publicly, agencies released cautious statements. NASA described 3I Atlas as an interstellar comet exhibiting unusual properties. ESA echoed the same, assuring citizens there was no immediate threat. The language was carefully chosen, designed to calm, not to inform. But behind the curtain, a very different tone prevailed. Satellite time was reallocated. Emergency budgets were quietly approved. At the Pentagon, simulations modeled scenarios ranging from communication attempts to planetary defense mobilization. China's National Space Administration redirected deep space antennas, usually reserved for lunar missions, while Russia repositioned ground-based radar to track every flicker from the strange visitor. Even Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin were discreetly contacted. Their heavy-lift rockets considered potential assets in case humanity decided it needed to launch something, whether to intercept, study, or defend. No one admitted it outright, but the truth was clear. The world's greatest powers no longer viewed 3I Atlas as just a comet. And yet, the object wasn't only shifting the balance of science and politics, it was shifting humanity itself. On one side were the hopefuls, those who saw the pulses as a message of connection. They believed this was proof that we were not alone, that we were finally part of something larger. Hashtags like Number Atlas Speaks filled social media, with artists, dreamers, and visionaries creating music and images inspired by the repeating line. On the other side were the fearful. For them, the signals represented a warning, not an invitation. Religious leaders in some communities preached that this was an omen, a test of faith. Conspiracy groups whispered that governments already knew the truth, that secret treaties with others had been signed long ago. And in underground forums, Darker voices called for preparations for war, convinced this was the opening move in a hostile encounter. Amid this divide, the scientists pushed forward. Data from the James Webb Telescope revealed that the nickel emissions from 3I Atlas were intensifying. Each pulse seemed to coincide with a faint surge of particles that streamed not outward but inward, as if the object were drawing energy rather than releasing it. Dr. Leclerc in France described it bluntly. It is feeding. Feeding on what? That was the question. Some theorized solar radiation. Others suggested it was pulling on the electromagnetic fields of nearby planets. A radical group of researchers even argued it might be harnessing the energy of space itself, bending laws of physics in ways humanity had only theorized. But no matter the theory, one truth emerged. 3I Atlas was not weakening as it approached Mars. It was growing stronger, its pulses clearer, its path more deliberate. And now, for the first time, humanity wasn't just observing, it was preparing. On Earth, the mystery of 3I Atlas was no longer confined to observatories and classified reports. It began bleeding quietly into daily life. In the skies, commercial pilots started reporting unusual instrument glitches. Over the Atlantic, one captain described a moment when the magnetic compass spun erratically before correcting itself. In Asia, another spoke of sudden turbulence that didn't match any weather radar, as if invisible currents were sweeping through the atmosphere. Beneath the oceans, submarine crews picked up faint humming sounds on their sonar, steady, rhythmic, and unlike any known marine source. The signals seemed to echo faintly, repeating the same 7.2-hour cycle that astronomers had already connected to 3I Atlas. Even technology on land wasn't immune. Power grids in South America flickered unexpectedly. Satellite TV signals wavered in Europe. Stock traders in New York complained of microsecond timing errors in quantum-linked financial systems. Tiny disruptions, barely noticeable in isolation, but globally they painted a troubling pattern. Nature itself seemed to sense something. Migratory birds in Canada altered their usual flight routes, veering south too early in the season. Herd animals in Africa shifted restlessly, avoiding grazing fields where GPS anomalies spiked. In Japan, fishermen reported schools of fish diving deeper than usual, avoiding the surface without clear reason. To the public, these were isolated stories, quickly forgotten. But to the scientists tracking the data, the connections were undeniable. Earth's magnetosphere, the invisible shield that protects us from cosmic radiation, was pulsing faintly, resonating with the same strange rhythm that 3I Atlas seemed to carry across the void. Dr. Elena Ruiz of Spain called it a cosmic heartbeat. Each pulse aligned not with solar flares, not with Earth's own cycles, but with the foreign light curve of an object millions of kilometers away. It was as if Earth itself was listening, and that thought terrified some and inspired others. In living rooms across the world, people began staying up late, watching live streams of the comet through amateur telescopes. Children pressed their faces against screens, whispering questions their parents couldn't answer. Artists painted glowing spheres suspended over landscapes, while poets filled the internet with words about connection and fear. Meanwhile, in the silence of deep space, 3i Atlas kept pulsing, each beat clearer than the last, as if it knew we were paying attention. The night of September 4th, 2025, became one of those dates whispered in hushed tones among astronomers, then splashed in bold headlines a week later. It started quietly, inside a dimly lit operations room at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The James Webb Space Telescope had captured another series of spectral scans from 3i Atlas. Nothing unusual at first, just repeating data streams of carbon dioxide, faint nickel emissions, and the expected flicker of its strange brightness cycle. But then came the spike. Buried in the numbers was a harmonic signature, not a natural scatter, not noise, but a repeating geometric pattern, hexagonal in nature, with perfect ratios. To human eyes, it looked less like a comet and more like an engineered lattice. Dr. Naomi Keller, one of the analysts on shift that night, described it later. It was as if the comet rang like a bell, and inside that ring was a blueprint, something symmetrical, structured. The data suggested hollowness. Not the fractured hollowness of ice caverns, but something smooth, deliberate, echoing like metal. Within hours, the discovery was marked classified. No public announcement, no press release, only encrypted cables to partner agencies in Europe and Asia. But secrecy never lasts long. Within 3 days, fragments of the finding appeared on encrypted forums, then leaked into mainstream outlets. One headline read, "Atlas isn't solid. Engineers see metal symmetry." The world paused. Was this still a comet or a probe? Scientists debated furiously. Some insisted the Webb's data could be misinterpreted, a trick of light and gas dynamics. Others pointed out the regular 7.2-hour pulse of light already hinted at machinery. Now, with structural echoes inside the body, coincidence seemed harder and harder to defend. On the streets, curiosity turned to awe and to fear. 1,000 videos flooded social media. Artists rendering 3i Atlas not as a comet, but as a hollow spacecraft, a vessel drifting from some distant star system. Meanwhile, back in Colombia, near the coordinates of the rumored Jesuit map of spheres, people began connecting dots. Theories emerged that 3i Atlas was not alone, that perhaps it belonged to a network of objects, some already resting quietly on Earth. The pulse continued. Every 7.2 hours, the glow rippled across the void. Not just light anymore, but a message one humanity had yet to understand. And now, for the first time, it wasn't just astronomers who felt it. Ordinary people swore they could sense it: headaches, restless dreams, even synchronized awakenings in the middle of the night. Whether real or imagined, the idea that Earth itself was resonating with a foreign heartbeat began to take root. The line between science and myth blurred, and as more data poured in, the question grew louder than ever. What if we're not just observing, but being observed in return? By mid-September 2025, 3i Atlas had become more than a comet. It was a canvas onto which the world projected its fears, hopes, and wildest imaginations. At universities, lecture halls filled overnight with students eager to hear professors dissect the latest web data. Equations filled chalkboards, comparing nickel emission ratios and modeling the object's erratic acceleration. Yet, for all the math, the conclusion remained unsettlingly vague. 3I Atlas refused to fit into any known category. Dr. David Harland, a planetary scientist in London, summed it up with a weary smile during a public talk. Every time we think we've pinned it down as a comet, it does something that comets don't do. And every time we propose something artificial, it finds a way to look natural again. It's as if it wants to stay right on that razor's edge between science and speculation. In living rooms around the globe, ordinary people tuned into late-night specials, podcasts, and live streams dedicated solely to 3I Atlas. Some channels leaned into hard science, breaking down spectroscopy and comet dynamics. Others embraced the fantastic, suggesting the object was a probe, a messenger, maybe even a fragment of some ancient stellar civilization drifting across the void. Meanwhile, governments walked a delicate line. Official statements were cautious, stressing that 3I Atlas posed no immediate danger, but classified cables told another story. Behind closed doors, defense departments weren't just worried about astronomy, they worried about signals. Patterns in the brightness cycle hinted at information encoding, the kind of thing radio astronomers spent lifetimes chasing. If it was deliberate, if someone had designed this object, then the light wasn't just light. It was a transmission. But here's what rattled the world most. People began to claim the object wasn't only being observed, it was observing back. Pilots flying transatlantic routes reported faint distortions on cockpit instruments, at times suspiciously close to the object's brightness pulses. Amateur radio operators shared recordings of strange clicks and whispers woven into static, coinciding perfectly with a 7.2-hour rhythm. And in remote villages where light pollution was low and the skies were still vast and ancient, people swore they saw Atlas flare brighter when they looked at it as if it noticed. Of course, skeptics argued these were coincidences, tricks of the mind, or the human tendency to weave patterns into chaos. And yet, the stories kept piling up. Even in the scientific community, there was a quiet unease. Some of the web engineers admitted privately that they no longer felt like they were observing a comet. One of them told a colleague over coffee, "It feels like we're in a conversation, but we don't know the language yet." The mystery was no longer confined to telescopes. It was beginning to seep into the collective consciousness. By late September, debates about 3I Atlas no longer belonged solely to astronomers. The comet, if it was a comet, had broken through the walls of academia and seeped into nearly every corner of public life. News broadcasts that once reserved their lead stories for politics or economics now lingered on live animations of its path across the solar system. Every flare, every unexpected brightness pulse was dissected by anchors as if the fate of nations hung in the data. On social media, hashtags like Number Atlas Whispers and Number the Third Visitor trended globally, gathering millions of posts each day. In classrooms, children whispered about it like an urban legend. teachers found themselves fielding questions they couldn't answer. Could Atlas see us? What if it comes closer? What if it's not alone? Even religions began to adapt the mystery into their sermons. Some faith leaders warned that it was a sign, a celestial messenger heralding change. Others dismissed it as a test of belief, a reminder not to mistake mystery for divinity. In small towns, prayer groups gathered at dusk, turning their eyes to the faint point of light beyond Mars, whispering hymns and hopes. But in the world of science, the tone was very different. The data had become undeniable. The object's acceleration was not random. The jitter in its velocity, the sharp, erratic increases, matched too cleanly with its brightness pulses. Every flare of light was paired with a microscopic shift in trajectory, like a nudge, like a hand guiding it forward. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory convened emergency sessions with colleagues at the European Space Agency. The Webb's latest spectrographs showed something stranger still. Nickel emissions spiked not continuously, but in precise cycles. On a timeline, they looked less like chemical outgassing and more like code. Theories fractured into camps. One insisted the object was natural, the product of some rare and exotic formation environment far beyond our understanding. Another argued for an engineered origin, pointing out that nothing in nature produces acceleration paired with rhythmic brightness pulses. A third camp, perhaps the most unsettling, suggested it was neither entirely natural nor artificial, but something in between. A hybrid of geology and design, a relic from a process the human mind could barely grasp. For every scientist who leaned on data, there were 10 voices outside the lab walls, turning speculation into certainty. Documentaries appeared overnight, blending real graphs with speculative CGI. Podcasters built entire empires around decoding the Atlas signal. And through it all, a simple unease threaded itself into the global mood. The sense that humanity was no longer merely observing the cosmos, but being drawn into something vast, deliberate, and deeply unknown. Atlas was no longer just a visitor from another star. It had become a mirror, reflecting back our oldest fear and our oldest dream that we are not alone. It was supposed to be routine. On the night of October 12th, the James Webb Space Telescope trained its mirror on 3I Atlas once again. For weeks, the object had kept to its unnerving rhythm. The flare every 7.2 hours, the faint acceleration, the whisper of nickel against the vacuum. But that night, something changed. Instead of one pulse, there were 3. Perfectly spaced, evenly timed, like the beat of a drum echoing through interstellar silence. At first, the data team thought it was an artifact, some glitch in the instrument, or a hiccup in transmission. But when NASA's Deep Space Network and Europe's swarm satellites confirmed the signal simultaneously, the truth sank in. This was not noise. This was a message. The triple beat repeated 5 times. Then silence. Then again 5 more times. It wasn't random. It wasn't chemical. It wasn't the blind chaos of gas escaping ice. This was structured, deliberate. On Earth, those awake enough to watch the live stream saw the raw graphs. 3 spikes rising like teeth, falling, rising again, within hours, physicists, cryptographers, and linguists were parsing the pattern. Some swore it was a prime number sequence. Others claimed it was an attempt at harmonics, the simplest language of the cosmos, rhythm. And then came the most terrifying moment of all. As the triple beat repeated, Webb's sensors caught something new in the coma, the faintest trace of geometry, a glimmer of angles where no angles should exist, a triangle of light, shifting and reforming, like panels opening and closing inside the haze of dust. For a brief 40 seconds, the comet's glow was not random, but architectural. And then, just as subtly, it was gone. Across the world, control rooms went silent. Some scientists cried, others refused to speak. Not because the data was unclear, but because it was too clear. For the first time, humanity wasn't looking at an interstellar rock behaving strangely. We were looking at something built. The implication struck like a wave. If it was built, then someone built it. If it was guided, then someone was guiding it. And if it was signaling, then someone somewhere wanted to be heard. Governments scrambled behind closed doors, their official statements muted, vague, careful. But outside those walls, the truth had already escaped. Leaked frames of the Webb's triangular glimmer appeared on forums, then on the news, then across every phone on Earth. And a new question overtook all others. What does Atlas want? In the days that followed, something unusual happened. For once, the world seemed united, not in panic, but in silence. The chatter of politics, markets, even sports, all dimmed. Because everyone knew there was a bigger story unfolding, one so vast that no headline could contain it. The Webb's images were replayed over and over. The triangular flash, the triple pulses, the shadow of something too geometric to be natural. But no agency dared release an official conclusion. Not NASA, not ESA, not the Vatican Observatory. Instead, all spoke in careful coded words. Anomalous behavior, unprecedented data, further study required. But in private, leaks continue. Astronomers whispered of models showing the pulses, aligning with hydrogen's spectral signature, the most basic building block of the universe. Was this a cosmic greeting or a warning? Others suggested the pattern mirrored radio transmissions from Earth in the 1,970 seconds, as if someone or something was reflecting our own voice back to us. Decades delayed. And then there was the silence. No more pulses, no more acceleration. The object simply drifted again, quiet and cold. As if whatever Atlas was, it had said what it needed to say and withdrawn into the void. That silence was worse than the message, because now every telescope, every ear on Earth was waiting for the next beat, waiting for the next light, waiting for the next proof that we are not alone. It may never come, or it may come tomorrow. But either way, the night sky will never look the same again, because now we know sometimes the stars whisper back. If you've stayed with me through this story, you already know how rare it is to glimpse mysteries this profound, and this is only the beginning. So, If you want to keep exploring the hidden corners of the universe with me, make sure to subscribe. And don't stop here, click the video on your screen now, because what you'll hear next makes this story seem almost ordinary.